The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on Thomas Mackenzie's weathered face as he guided his mule-drawn cart along the narrow mountain trail. 3 years had passed since he'd buried his wife Sarah beneath the old oak behind their cabin, and in those 3 years, the 42-year-old lumberjack had spoken to no one but himself and the wind that howled through the pines. His calloused hands gripped the reins tighter as memories of Sarah's laughter echoed in his mind. She'd always said he was too hard on himself, too quick to shut out the world when pain came knocking. But Thomas had learned that isolation was safer than hope. Hope had a way of breaking a man's heart all over again. The trail ahead curved sharply around a massive boulder, and as Thomas rounded the bend, the acrid smell of smoke filled his nostrils. His mule snorted nervously, ears flicking forward as the stench of burned wood and something far worse reached them both. Thomas pulled the reins, bringing the cart to a halt, as his eyes took in the scene before him. A wagon lay overturned in the dirt, its wooden sides splintered and charred. Scattered belongings littered the ground: a woman's torn dress, a child's jouts, wooden toy pots and pans glinting in the harsh sunlight. The bodies of 2 adults lay motionless near the wreckage, their clothes soaked with dried blood that had turned the desert sand dark beneath them. Thomas climbed down from his cart slowly, his boots crunching on broken glass as he approached the carnage. Bandits, he realized grimly. The same lawless men who'd been terrorizing travelers along this route for months. Taking what they wanted and leaving death in their wake, he was about to turn away. To continue on his journey and leave this tragedy behind like so many others he'd witnessed in his years on the frontier. When he heard it, a soft whimper, barely audible above the whisper of wind through the rocks. Thomas froze, his heart pounding as he listened. There it was again, coming from behind the overturned wagon. He moved carefully around the wreckage, and his breath caught in his throat at what he found. A small boy, no more than 7 years old, sat huddled against the wagon's broken wheel. His dark hair hung in tangled strands around his face, and his copper-toned skin was streaked with dirt and tears. APACHE, Thomas realized, noting the distinctive beadwork on the child's torn shirt and the traditional moccasins on his small feet. The boy's large brown eyes looked up at Thomas with a mixture of terror and desperate hope that struck the lumberjack like a physical blow.
Those eyes reminded him of a wounded deer he'd once found, caught in a hunter's trap wild-eyed, afraid, but still clinging to life with fierce determination.
"Easy there, son," Thomas said softly, crouching down slowly so as not to frighten the child further. "I'm not going to hurt you." The boy pressed himself harder against the wagon wheel, his small body trembling. Thomas could see dried blood on the child's arms where thorns had scratched him, and his lips were cracked from thirst and exposure. "You understand English?" Thomas asked gently. The boy nodded slightly, never taking his eyes off the bearded stranger. Thomas looked around at the devastation, piecing together what must have happened. The wagon belonged to a mixed family, likely a white trader who'd married an APACHE woman. Such unions weren't uncommon on the frontier, though they often faced prejudice from both cultures. The bandits had probably attacked for the trade goods, not caring about the innocent lives they destroyed in the process. "Where's your family, boy?" Thomas asked, though the answer was written in the child's haunted expression and the bodies lying in the dust. The boy's lower lip trembled, and fresh tears carved clean tracks through the grime on his cheeks. He pointed shakily toward the 2 corpses, then buried his face in his small hands, his thin shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Thomas felt something crack inside his chest, a wall he'd built around his heart 3 years ago. When he'd lowered Sarah's coffin into the ground, he'd sworn never to let anyone close enough to hurt him again. But this child's pain called to something deeper than his own fear. "What's your name, son?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion he'd thought long buried. The boy looked up through his tears. "Joseph," he whispered, his voice hoarse from crying. "Joseph Running Bear." Joseph Thomas repeated, the name feeling strange on his tongue after so many months of silence. "I'm Thomas." He studied the child's face, seeing intelligence. Behind the fear, strength beneath the vulnerability. This boy had survived whatever hell had befallen his family. He'd hidden while his parents were murdered, had stayed alive in the desert heat for what must have been at least a day. maybe more. You hurt anywhere, Joseph? Thomas asked, noting how the boy favored his left arm. Joseph shook his head, though Thomas could see the lie in his eyes. Pride, even at 7 years old, the boy had pride. It was something Thomas understood, something he respected. The lumberjack stood slowly, his mind racing. He could leave the boy here and report the attack to the sheriff in the next town. The child would be sent to an orphanage, if he was lucky, or to one of the government schools that stripped native children of their culture and identity. Or worse, he might simply be forgotten. Another casualty of a frontier that chewed up the innocent and spat them out without ceremony. Thomas looked at Joseph again, at those dark eyes that held too much pain for such a young face, and made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Joseph, he said quietly, extending his hand toward the boy, how would you like to come home with me? The child stared at the offered hand as if it might disappear like a mirage. Home, he whispered. I've got a cabin up in the mountains, good water, plenty of food, warm bed by the fire. Could use some company, tell you the truth. Thomas kept his voice steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. What do you say? For a long moment, Joseph didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached out with his small, dirty hand and placed it in Thomas's calloused palm. The trust in that simple gesture nearly brought the lumberjack to his knees. The ride to Thomas's cabin took 2 days, with Joseph perched silently beside him on the wagon seat, his small body rigid with weariness despite his exhaustion. Thomas had wrapped the boy in his own wool coat, but Joseph still shivered not. From cold, Thomas realized, but from shock and the bone-deep trauma of losing everything he'd ever known. They spoke little during the journey. Thomas had never been good with words, and the boy seemed lost in his own world of grief and confusion. But as they climbed higher into the pine-covered mountains, Thomas found himself stealing glances at his unexpected companion. Wondering what he'd gotten himself into, the cabin appeared through the trees just as the sun was setting behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows across the clearing Thomas had carved from the wilderness. It was a simple structure, 2 rooms, a stone chimney, and a small barn where he kept his tools and the mule. Sarah had always talked about adding a second story, maybe a proper kitchen, but those dreams had died with her. This is it, Thomas said as he pulled the wagon to a stop. Home. Joseph looked up at the cabin with wide eyes, taking in the neat stack of firewood by the door. The small garden plot where vegetables grew in orderly rows, the wooden chair on the porch where Thomas sat in the evenings, drinking coffee and watching the sun disappear behind the mountains. It's quiet, Joseph observed, his first words in hours.
Yes.
Thomas agreed, climbing down from the wagon. Quiet can be good, though. Gives a man time to think. He helped Joseph down, noting how the boy winced when he put weight on his left foot. Inside the cabin, Thomas lit the oil lamp and stirred the coals in the fireplace back to life. Grateful he'd had the foresight to bank them before leaving on his supply run. The cabin was spartanly furnished, a table and 2 chairs. A bed in the far corner, shelves lined with canned goods and basic supplies. Sarah's rocking chair still sat by the fireplace, though Thomas hadn't touched it in 3 years. Dust motes danced in the lamplight. The air smelled of pine wood and the lingering scent of the coffee Thomas had brewed that morning. You hungry, boy? Thomas asked, and Joseph nodded quickly. The lumberjack rummaged through his supplies, coming up with a can of beans and some hardtack. Not much, but it would do until he could cook something proper tomorrow, as Joseph ate with the desperate hunger of a child who hadn't had a real meal in days. Thomas found himself studying the boy's face in the firelight. There were bruises he hadn't noticed before, a purple mark on the child's temple, scrapes on his knuckles that spoke of a desperate fight or flight through rough terrain. Joseph Thomas said carefully, "You want to tell me what happened out there?" The boy's spoon froze halfway to his mouth, and for a moment Thomas thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Joseph began to speak. "Mama and Papa were taking trade goods to Fort Verde," he said, staring into the fire. "Papa said we'd make enough money to buy more land, maybe some cattle. Mama was excited. She wanted to build a real house, with glass windows and a parlor like the white ladies had in town." Thomas nodded, encouraging the boy to continue.
8.
Been traveling for 2 days when they came? Joseph's voice grew smaller. 5 men on horses, with bandanas over their faces. Papa tried to fight, but they had guns, and we only had Papa's old rifle. They shot him first, then... Joseph's voice broke. Tears began flowing again. Thomas reached across the table and placed his hand gently on the boy's shoulder. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. I hid, Joseph whispered, shame coloring his voice. Under the wagon when the shooting started, I heard Mama screaming, heard her calling for me, but I was too scared to come out. I just laid there like a coward while they killed her. You weren't a coward, Thomas said firmly. You did what your parents would have wanted you to do. You stayed alive. That took courage, Joseph. More courage than most grown men have. Joseph looked up at him with surprise, as if he'd never considered that possibility. How long were you out there alone? Thomas asked. 2 days, maybe 3. I lost track. I was afraid to leave in case Mama and Papa woke up, but they never did. I knew they were dead, but I kept hoping, ... Joseph's voice trailed off. Thomas felt his heart constrict. This child had sat with his parents' bodies for days, hoping for a miracle that would never come. The strength it must have taken, the loyalty and love, it reminded Thomas of everything he'd valued about family before grief had taught him to wall off his heart. You're safe now, Thomas said, meaning it with every fiber of his being. Those men can't hurt you here. But what if they come looking for me? Joseph asked, fear flickering in his dark eyes. Then they'll have to go through me first, Thomas replied. And he was surprised by the fierce protectiveness in his own voice. And I promise you, son, that's not going to be easy for them. Over the following days, Thomas began to understand the magnitude of what he'd undertaken. Joseph was intelligent and resilient, but he was also deeply traumatized, startled at sudden noises, had nightmares that left him crying out in both English and Apache, and flinched whenever Thomas moved too quickly. The boy was also caught between 2 worlds in ways that broke Thomas's heart. Joseph spoke perfect English, but he also knew Apache customs and traditions from his mother's people. He could read and write, his father had taught him, but he also knew how to track animals and read weather signs in ways that amazed the lumberjack. My mama used to say I was like a bridge, Joseph told Thomas one evening as they sat on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. She said I could walk in both worlds, help people understand each other. Sounds like a smart woman, Thomas replied, thinking of Sarah and her own dreams of building bridges between different kinds of people. Do you think she was wrong? Joseph asked about me being a bridge. Maybe I'm just nothing, not Apache enough for the reservation, not white enough for the towns. Thomas looked at the boy seriously. I think your mama was right. I think you're exactly what this world needs. Someone who understands that people are people, no matter what they look like or where they come from. As the weeks passed, Thomas began to see glimpses of the boy Joseph had been before tragedy. Struck, he was curious about everything. How Thomas felled trees, why certain plants grew better in shade. What made the wind sound different in the pines versus the aspens? He had a quick laugh when something struck him as funny. And he possessed an artist's eye for beauty, often stopping their work to point out a particularly stunning sunset or the way morning mist clung to the valley below. But trust came slowly. Joseph would flinch when Thomas reached for him, even in kindness. He hoarded food under his bed until Thomas gently explained that there was always more, that he would never go hungry again. And at night, Thomas could hear him crying softly, calling for his parents in whispered, patchy words that sounded like prayers. The breakthrough came 3 weeks after Joseph's arrival. Thomas was splitting logs behind the cabin when he heard a commotion from the direction of the barn, racing around the building. He found Joseph backed against the wall by a large black bear that had wandered into the clearing, probably drawn. By the scent of the salt pork Thomas kept stored there, the bear wasn't attacking yet, but it was clearly agitated, swaying back and forth as it tried to decide if the small human was a threat. Joseph stood perfectly still, his eyes locked on the animals, his breathing slow and controlled. Thomas reached for his rifle. But before he could raise it, Joseph began to speak, not in English, but in Apache, his voice low and melodic. Was singing, Thomas realized, some kind of traditional song. The bear's ears pricked forward. Gradually, its aggressive posturing relaxed. For several long minutes, boy and bear regarded each other, while Joseph continued his soft chanting. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the bear turned and ambled back into the forest, leaving Joseph standing alone against the barn wall. Thomas lowered his rifle, staring at the boy in amazement. "What did you just do?" Joseph looked up at him with the first real smile Thomas had seen since finding him on the trail. "Mama taught me that song. She said animals understand respect, even if they don't understand words." The bear wasn't mean, just hungry and confused. In that moment, Thomas saw not just the traumatized child he'd been caring for, but the remarkable young man Joseph was becoming. Here was someone who could face down a wild bear with nothing but songs and courage, who understood that fear and aggression often masked pain and confusion. "Your mama was a wise woman," Thomas said softly. "She was," Joseph agreed, and for the first time speaking of his mother didn't bring tears to his eyes. "I think she would have liked you, Mr. Thomas. You have kind hands like Papa did." That night, as they sat by the fire, sharing a dinner of venison stew and cornbread, Joseph asked the question Thomas had been dreading. "Are you going to keep me?" the boy asked quietly. "Or are you going to send me away when winter comes?" Thomas set down his spoon and looked across the table at this child who had somehow, without his permission, worked his way into the guarded chambers of his heart. "Joseph," he said carefully, "I can't replace your parents. Nobody could do that. But if you want to stay, if you want to make this your home, then I'd be honored to have you as my son." Joseph's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness this time, but of hope and relief, and something that looked remarkably like love. "I'd like that," he whispered. "I'd like that very much, Papa Thomas." Winter came early that year, blanketing the mountains in 3 feet of snow and forcing Thomas and Joseph into the close quarters of the cabin for weeks at a time. Thomas had worried about how they'd manage, 2 people still learning to be a family, confined together with nothing but each other for company. But as the months passed, he discovered that Joseph's presence had transformed not just his daily routine, but his entire outlook on life. The boy was eager to learn everything Thomas could teach him. They spent long evenings by the fire, while Thomas showed Joseph how to maintain and sharpen tools, how to read the grain in different types of wood, how to calculate board feet and plan cuts for maximum efficiency. Joseph's quick mind absorbed it all, and soon he was asking questions that challenged even Thomas's decades of experience. "Hey, why do you cut the trees in winter, Papa Thomas?" Joseph asked. One snowy evening, looking up from the piece of pine he was carving into a small horse. "Cut in winter's drier. Season's better," Thomas explained, watching the careful way Joseph handled his knife. "Trees store their sap in the roots during cold months, so the lumber's less likely to warp or crack, like the way bears store fat for hibernation." Exactly like that. Everything in nature has its seasons, its rhythms. A good lumberjack learns to work with those rhythms instead of fighting them. Joseph nodded thoughtfully, then returned to his carving. Thomas watched the boy's careful attention to detail, the way he studied the wood grain before making each cut, felt a familiar pride swell in his chest. The feeling still surprised him sometimes, this fierce protective love he'd developed for a child who'd appeared in his life like an answer to a prayer he'd never thought to pray. As winter deepened, Joseph began to share more stories about his parents and his mother's Apache heritage. He taught Thomas's words in the Apache language, explained the meaning behind traditional patterns and symbols, and shared stories his grandmother had told him about the old days when the Apache moved freely across the desert. "Hey," Mama always said. "I was lucky to know both ways of living," Joseph said one night as they worked on repairing a broken chair. "She said some people only see the world through one window, but I could look through two." "What do you see when you look through your Apache window?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. Joseph was quiet for a moment, considering. "I see that everything is connected, the trees, the animals, the rocks, the water. I see that taking only what you need and giving thanks for it is important. And I see that family isn't just the people you're born to, but the people who choose to love you." The simple wisdom of it struck Thomas like a physical blow. This 8-year-old boy who had lost everything and somehow found the strength too. build a new life, understood something about family that Thomas had forgotten in his years of grief and isolation. "What do you see through your other window?" Thomas asked softly. "I see that reading and writing can preserve stories forever, that building things with your hands creates something lasting, and that sometimes the best way to honor the people you've lost is to keep living the way they taught you to live." As spring arrived and the snow began to melt, Thomas realized he needed to make some practical decisions about Joseph's future. The boy needed schooling beyond what Thomas could provide, and he needed contact with other children. But the nearest town, Cedar Ridge, was 40 miles away. Thomas wasn't sure how a mixed race APACHE boy would be received there. The decision was made for him when Sheriff Don Morrison rode up to the cabin one warm April morning. His horse, lathered with sweat and his face grim with purpose. "Thomas Mackenzie," the sheriff called out as Thomas emerged from the barn, Joseph close behind him. "That's me," Thomas replied cautiously. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Morrison's eyes fixed on Joseph, and Thomas felt his protective instincts flare. "Got reports of a missing APACHE boy, taken from the site of a bandit attack back in the fall. Boy about this one's age and description." "Joseph's not missing," Thomas said firmly, placing his hand on the boy's shoulder. "He's my son." The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "Your son? That's not what the army tells me. They say this boy belongs on the reservation with his mother's people." Thomas felt Joseph tense beside him, and anger rose in his chest like a tide. "This boy's parents are dead, Sheriff, murdered by bandits. I found him, saved him, and I've been caring for him for 6 months. He's not going anywhere." "Now hold on, Mackenzie," Morrison said, dismounting from his horse. "Not saying you did anything wrong, but there are procedures to follow. The boy needs to be evaluated, his situation assessed by proper authorities." "The proper authority for Joseph is me," Thomas said, his voice steady, but carrying an undertone of steel that made the sheriff take a step back. "I'm his legal guardian now. You got papers to prove that?" Thomas felt his heart sink. In his desire to give Joseph a safe home, he'd never thought about the legal aspects of adoption, especially the adoption of a Native American child by a white man. Joseph stepped forward then, his young voice clear and strong. "Sheriff Morrison, my name is Joseph Running Bear Mackenzie. This is my papa, Thomas Mackenzie. He saved my life and gave me a home when I had nothing. I choose to stay with him." Morrison looked down at the boy, clearly surprised by his articulate response. "Son, it's not that simple. There are laws about where Indian children can live, who can care for them. Are you going to separate a family?" Joseph asked, and Thomas was amazed by the quiet dignity in the boy's voice. "Are you going to punish my papa for saving my life?" The sheriff looked uncomfortable, glancing between Thomas and Joseph. "Look, I'm just doing my job. There are people in Washington who make decisions about Indian affairs, and they say APACHE children belong with APACHE families. The APACHE families I might have stayed with are scattered across 3 reservations," Joseph said. "My grandmother is dead. My uncles moved to New Mexico. Papa Thomas is the only family I have left, and I'm the only family he has. Why would you want to break that apart?" Thomas felt a surge of pride at the boy's courage and eloquence, but he also knew that individual wishes rarely mattered when government policy was involved. Sheriff Thomas said carefully, "What would it take to make this legal? To make sure Joseph can stay where he belongs?" Morrison rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "Well, there'd have to be hearings, paperwork filed with the territorial authorities. You'd need character witnesses, proof you can provide for the boy's education and upbringing. And honestly, it's not common. For a white man to adopt an Indian child, there might be resistance, and we'll overcome the resistance," Thomas said firmly. "Whatever it takes." Over the following weeks, Thomas threw himself into the legal process with the same determination he'd once brought to clearing forests. He rode to Cedar Ridge to meet with the territorial judge, wrote letters to officials he'd never heard of, and gathered testimonials from the few neighbors who knew him. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell. The territory's first female physician had heard about Joseph's case and rode out to the cabin to meet him personally. She was a stern-faced woman in her 50s who'd spent years advocating for the rights of children. regardless of their race or background. I've seen too many native children torn from loving homes and sent to places where they're treated as problems to be solved rather than human beings to be nurtured, she told Thomas after spending an afternoon talking with Joseph. This boy is clearly thriving in your care. He's intelligent, well-mannered, and most importantly, he feels safe and loved. That's rarer than you might think. Dr. Hartwell agreed to serve as a character witness and to write a report recommending that Joseph be allowed to remain with Thomas. Her reputation carried weight with the territorial authorities. Gradually, the legal obstacles began to fall away. The final hearing was held on a hot, summer day in the courthouse at Cedar Ridge. Thomas sat at a wooden table with Joseph beside him, facing a panel of 3 men who would decide their fate. The judge, a weathered man named Harrison Cole, looked at the papers before him with the weary expression of someone who'd seen too many complicated cases. Mr. Mackenzie, Judge Cole said, you understand that what you're asking for is unusual? Adoption across racial lines is rare in this territory. Yes, Your Honor, Thomas replied, but unusual doesn't mean wrong. The judge nodded slightly. And young man, he said, addressing Joseph directly, you understand that if this adoption is approved, you'll be legally bound to Mr. Mackenzie as his son? You'll take his name, live by his rules, be part of his family in all ways? Joseph stood up, his small frame straight and dignified. Your Honor, Papa Thomas has already been my real father for almost a year. Making it legal just means other people will recognize what we already know, that family isn't about blood. It's about love and commitment, and choosing to take care of each other. A murmur went through the courtroom, and Thomas saw several people nodding in approval. Judge Cole studied Joseph for a long moment, then looked at Thomas. Mr. Mackenzie, I'm going to ask you one question, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Are you prepared to raise this boy to understand and respect both sides of his heritage? Will you help him remain connected to his Apache roots, while also preparing him to make his way in the white world? Thomas stood, placing his hand on Joseph's shoulder. Your Honor, my job as Joseph's father is to help him become the best version of himself, whatever that looks like. If that means learning Apache traditions alongside English literature, teaching him to track deer as well as calculate lumber prices, then that's what we'll do. Joseph will always know where he came from, and I'll make sure he's proud of all of it. Judge Cole was quiet for several minutes, reviewing the documents before him. Finally, he looked up with something that might have been a smile. In the matter of the adoption petition of Thomas Mackenzie for the minor child known as Joseph Running Bear, this court finds that the best interests of the child are clearly served by allowing him to remain in Mr. Mackenzie's care. The adoption is approved. Joseph Running Bear Mackenzie, you are now legally the son of Thomas Mackenzie, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. The gavel came down with a sound like thunder, and Thomas felt Joseph's small hand slip into his. Looking down at his son, his legal recognized son, Thomas saw tears of joy streaming down the boy's face. We did it, Papa, Joseph whispered. Yes, Thomas replied, his own voice thick with emotion. We did it, son. 5 years had passed since that pivotal day in the courthouse, and the cabin in the mountains had truly become a home. Joseph, now 13, had grown tall and lean, his childhood softness replaced by the wiry strength of a boy who worked alongside his father in the demanding world of frontier logging. The traumatized 7-year-old Thomas had found on that dusty trail was now a confident young man who moved between his Apache heritage and his adopted family's world with the grace his mother had always predicted. The morning sun slanted through the pine trees as Thomas watched Joseph demonstrate the proper technique for notching a tree to his younger cousin, Marcus, who had come to spend the summer with them. Marcus was the son of Thomas's brother William, a banker from Denver who'd initially disapproved of Thomas's adoption of an Indian boy, but had come to respect both Joseph's character and the strong bond between father and son. See how Joseph angles the cut. Thomas called out to Marcus, who was struggling with his axe. It's not just chopping randomly. He's thinking about where he wants the tree to fall, how to control its path. Joseph nodded, wiping sweat from his forehead. Papa Thomas taught me that cutting trees is like solving a puzzle. You have to read the lean, check for deadwood, consider the wind direction. One careless cut can kill you. Marcus, pale and soft, from his city upbringing, looked skeptical. Seems like a lot of thinking for just cutting down a tree. Everything worth doing requires thinking, Joseph replied with the patient wisdom that never failed to amaze Thomas. My Apache grandmother used to say that hasty hands create lasting troubles. As the boys worked, Thomas reflected on how much their lives had changed. The logging business had grown steadily, helped by Joseph's keen eye for quality timber and his natural ability to negotiate with both white customers and the Apache scouts, who sometimes guided them to the best groves. Joseph's reputation for honesty and fair dealing had opened doors that might have remained closed to Thomas alone. More importantly, Joseph had thrived academically. Dr. Hartwell had arranged for him to study with the territorial circuit teacher. During winter months, and his hunger for knowledge seemed endless, he read everything he could get his hands on: technical manuals, literature, history, and scientific journals that Thomas barely understood. But Joseph never let his book learning separate him from his practical skills or his cultural roots. Papa Thomas, Joseph said that evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, I've been thinking about what I want to do after I finish my studies. Thomas looked up from the piece of harness he was mending. At 13, Joseph was already thinking beyond the mountain cabin, and while Thomas was proud of his son's ambition, the thought of him leaving created a hollow ache in his chest. What's on your mind, son? I want to be a lawyer, Joseph said quietly. I want to help families like ours, mixed families, adopted children, people who don't fit into neat categories. I want to make sure other kids don't have to go through what we went through too. Stay together. Thomas felt his throat constrict with emotion. That's a fine goal, Joseph. It'll take a lot of schooling, though. You'd have to go back east, probably. Study at a real university? I know, Joseph said. And I know it means leaving here for a while, but I'd come back, Papa. This will always be my home. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Thomas tensed. Visitors after dark were unusual and often meant trouble. He reached for the rifle that hung by the door, but relaxed when he recognized the voice calling out from the darkness. Thomas Mackenzie. It's Dan Morrison. Not alone, but we're not looking for trouble. Sheriff Morrison emerged from the trees leading a small group to other men Thomas didn't recognize, and a woman carrying a bundle in her arms. Even in the dim light from the cabin windows, Thomas could see that all three adults looked exhausted and frightened. Evening, Sheriff, Thomas called out, though he kept his rifle within easy reach. What brings you up the mountain this late? Morrison dismounted heavily. Got a situation, Thomas. Bandits hit a wagon train down near Prescott 3 days ago. Same gang that's been terrorizing folks all summer. These people managed to escape, but they've got nowhere else to go. The woman stepped forward, and Thomas could see she was young. Probably not much older than Joseph. The bundle in her arms stirred, and he realized she was carrying a baby. Please, she said, her voice breaking with exhaustion and desperation. They killed my husband, burned our wagon. We've been walking for 2 days. The baby needs food, needs shelter. Thomas looked at Joseph, who had stood up and was studying the strangers with the same careful assessment Thomas had taught him to use when evaluating potential customers. Thomas asked quietly. Joseph stepped forward, his young face serious. Ma'am, I'm Joseph Mackenzie. This is my father, Thomas. We'd be honored to help you and your baby. The woman's face crumpled with relief. Thank you, she whispered. Thank you so much, as they helped the refugees inside and settled them by the fire. Thomas learned their story. Emma Clearwater was 19 years old. She was married less than a year to a young homesteader named David. They'd been traveling to California with their 3-month-old daughter Sarah when the bandits struck. Emma had escaped only because David had sacrificed himself, too, by her time to run with the baby. The two men were brothers, Jake and Pete Rawlings, who'd been traveling with the Clearwaters as hired guards. They'd fought bravely, but been overwhelmed by superior numbers and firepower. The thing is, Sheriff Morrison said, as Emma nursed her baby by the firelight, these folks don't have anywhere to go. Emma's got no family back east, and the Rawlings brothers lost their own place to drought last year. I was hoping maybe you could put them up for a few days while we figure out what to do. Thomas looked around his small cabin, already crowded with 5 adults, a teenager, and a baby. It would be difficult, but Sarah would have wanted him to help. And more than that, he could see in Joseph's eyes the same compassion that had driven Thomas to rescue him 5 years earlier. They can stay as long as they need, Thomas said firmly. We'll make room. Over the following days, the cabin buzzed with activity as its residents adapted to the temporary arrangements. Emma proved to be a capable cook and housekeeper, grateful for the chance to contribute while she recovered from her ordeal. The Rawlings brothers were experienced outdoorsmen who quickly made themselves useful with repairs and maintenance around the property, but it was Joseph who surprised Thomas most. The boy took naturally to helping with baby Sarah, displaying a gentle patience that reminded Thomas of how carefully Joseph had once tended injured animals he found in the forest. He sang to the baby in both English and APACHE, the same lullabies his mother had sung to him. You're good with her, Emma observed one evening as Joseph rocked Sarah to sleep. I remember what it felt like to be small and scared, Joseph replied simply. Babies don't understand why bad things happen, but they know when someone cares about them. Emma looked at him with new respect. Sheriff Morrison told me your story about how Mr. Mackenzie found you and adopted you. That was very brave of him. It was brave of both of us, Joseph said thoughtfully. Papa Thomas was brave enough to open his heart again after losing his wife. I was brave enough to trust someone new after losing my parents. Sometimes the biggest courage is just choosing to keep loving people, even when you know it might hurt. Emma wiped away a tear. Your parents would be proud of the young man you've become. I hope so, Joseph replied. I try to live in a way that honors both the family I was born to and the family I chose. As the weeks passed, what had started as a temporary arrangement began to feel more permanent. Emma had no desire to return to the dangerous trail, and the Rawlings brothers had found satisfaction in the honest work of logging. Thomas discovered that having a larger household brought unexpected joys, evening conversations around the dinner table, the sound of laughter echoing through the cabin, the comfort of knowing that no one had to face their problems alone. It was during this time that the bandits came. Thomas was in the forest with Jake and Pete, marking trees for the next day's cutting, when they heard the sound of gunshots from the direction of the cabin. The 3 men looked at each other for one frozen moment, then began running through the trees, their hearts pounding with fear and determination. They emerged from the forest to see 5 mounted men surrounding the cabin, their faces covered with bandanas, their weapons drawn. One of them was shouting demands while the others kept their guns trained on the building. Come out of there, the leader called. We know you're hiding that woman and her brat. Hand him over and nobody gets hurt. Thomas felt cold fury wash over him. These were the same men who had murdered Joseph's parents, who had killed Emma's husband, who had terrorized innocent families across the territory. And now they had come to his home, threatening his family. Jake, Pete, he whispered, circle around back. Get into the cabin through the rear window if you can. I'm going to create a distraction. Thomas, there are 5 of them, Jake protested. You can't take them all. I don't have to take them all, Thomas replied grimly. I just have to hold them off long enough for you two to get inside and protect the others. Before either man could object, Thomas stepped out of the trees, his rifle raised. You men are trespassing on my property, he called out in a voice that carried across the clearing. I suggest you mount up and ride out while you still can. The bandit leader laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the cabin walls. Well, look what we got here. The famous Thomas Mackenzie, hiding behind his rifle like a coward. Hey, we heard you. Got yourself a pet Indian boy, and you're playing house with that widow woman? All I've got is a family, Thomas said steadily, and I protect what's mine. 5 against 1, old man. Sure you want to play those odds? Thomas was about to respond when the cabin door opened and Joseph stepped out, carrying Thomas's spare rifle with the easy competence of someone who'd been trained in its use since childhood. 5 against 2, Joseph said calmly, taking position beside his father, and we've got the advantage of fighting for something worth dying for. The bandit leader's attention shifted to Joseph, and Thomas saw recognition flicker in the man's eyes. Well, I'll be damned. You're that APACHE brat from the wagon train. Should have finished you off when I had the chance. You killed my birth parents, Joseph said, his voice steady despite the rage Thomas could see burning in his eyes. But you made a mistake when you let me live. You created an enemy who knows your face, who spent 5 years getting strong. Enough to make you pay. Big words from a half-breed kid, the leader sneered. Let's see how tough you are when you never finish the sentence. Joseph's rifle cracked, and the bandit tumbled from his horse, clutching his shoulder. The other 4 men wheeled their mounts, trying to bring their weapons to bear. But Thomas and Joseph had already taken cover behind the woodpile. The battle was brief but fierce. Jake and Pete had managed to get inside the cabin and were firing from the windows, while Thomas and Joseph kept the bandits pinned down with accurate shots from their protected position. The criminals, accustomed to attacking defenseless travelers, found themselves outgunned and outmaneuvered by determined defenders fighting on familiar ground. When the smoke cleared, 2 bandits were dead. 2 were wounded and surrendering, and their leader was alive but in no condition to continue his reign of terror. Sheriff Morrison arrived with a posse just as Thomas and Joseph were tying up the survivors. Looks like you boys had yourselves quite a fight, Morrison observed, surveying the scene. They came looking for Mrs. Clearwater and her baby Thomas. Explained, we convinced them to look elsewhere.
Oh.
Morrison nodded approvingly. These are the same men who've been terrorizing the territory for months. There's a substantial reward for their capture. More than enough to help Mrs. Clearwater and the Rawlings brothers get back on their feet. As the sheriff and his men led the prisoners away, Thomas found himself alone with Joseph on the porch, both of them still shaking from the adrenaline of the fight. You did good today, son, Thomas said quietly. Your birth parents would be proud. I kept thinking about what you taught me, that sometimes you have to stand up and fight for what matters. Even when you're scared, Joseph replied. I was. Terrified, Papa Thomas. But I couldn't let them hurt our family. Being scared doesn't make you a coward, Thomas said, echoing the words he'd spoken to a traumatized 7-year-old 5 years earlier. It makes you human. What matters is what you do with that fear. In the days that followed, the cabin gradually returned to normal. Emma decided to stay in the area, using her share of the reward money to buy a small house in Cedar Ridge where she could raise Sarah in safety. The Rawlings brothers pooled their money to purchase a homestead of their own, though they continued to work with Thomas during the busy logging seasons. As autumn painted the mountains in brilliant colors, Thomas and Joseph found themselves alone. Again, but their relationship had deepened through the trials they'd faced together. They were no longer just a man and a rescued boy, but true father and son, bound by love, respect, and shared purpose. Papa Thomas, Joseph said one evening as they sat on the porch, watching the sun set behind the peaks, I've been thinking more about becoming a lawyer. Still set on that path? Thomas asked. More than ever. Today I realize that the law isn't just about rules and procedures, it's about protecting people who can't protect themselves. It's about making sure families like ours can stay together, that people like Emma and baby Sarah have someone to speak for them when they're vulnerable. Thomas nodded slowly. It's a hard road, son. You'll face prejudice, people who think a half-Apache boy doesn't belong in a courtroom. Let them think that, Joseph said with quiet confidence. I'll prove them wrong, the same way I proved wrong everyone who said we couldn't be a real family. I'll work twice as hard, be twice as prepared, and never forget where I came from or who taught me what really matters. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Thomas reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He'd thought his life was over when Sarah died, that he was destined to live out his days in lonely isolation. But finding Joseph had taught him that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as tragedies, that love can bloom in the most unexpected places. And that family is defined not by blood, but by the choice to care for each other through all of life's storms. Whatever path you choose, son, Thomas said softly, know that you'll always have a home here. This cabin, these mountains, this family, they're part of you now, just like you're part of them. Joseph smiled, the expression transforming his face from that of a serious young man into the joyful child Thomas remembered from their early days together. I know, Papa, and no matter how far I travel or what I accomplish, I'll never forget. The man who saw a scared little boy on a dusty trail and decided to love him anyway. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the promise of winter, but also the warmth of a love that had proven stronger than tragedy, prejudice, and time itself. In the growing darkness, father and son sat together in comfortable silence, two souls who had found in each other the family they'd both needed, the home they'd both been searching for, and the unbreakable bond that would sustain them through whatever challenges lay ahead. Their story had begun with loss and fear, but it had become something beautiful, a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of chosen family, and the enduring truth that love, once given freely, creates ripples that extend far beyond what we can imagine. In years to come, Joseph would indeed become a lawyer, fighting for the rights of those society had forgotten. He would marry, have children of his own, teach them the lessons Thomas had taught him about courage, compassion, and the true meaning of family. And Thomas, now in his 50s, would live to see his son's children playing in the same clearing, where he'd once taught Joseph to split logs and read the signs of changing weather. He would watch with pride as his legacy lived on, not just in the trees he'd planted or the cabin he'd built, but in the man he'd helped raise and the values he'd instilled. The mountains would remain, ancient and unchanging, but the love between. A widowed lumberjack and an orphaned Apache boy had created something eternal, a family forged not by blood but by choice, not by chance but by the conscious decision to see past differences and embrace the common humanity that connects us all. In the end, that was the greatest timber Thomas Mackenzie ever harvested, not the trees he'd felled in the forest, but the growth he'd nurtured in the heart of a boy who became his son, and in his own heart, which had learned to love again after believing it was forever broken. Their story would be remembered not as a tale of tragedy overcome, but as a celebration of the families we create when we choose to open our hearts to the unexpected gifts life offers, even in our darkest moments.